The first thing Dara Warzeniak noticed when she woke up was the light. Not her alarm, the light. It came through the window at the wrong angle, thin and white, the kind of light that predated the sun by about 40 minutes and meant she'd slept badly again, and her body had decided to stop pretending otherwise. She lay there for a moment, listening to the sound of the settlement. The low thrum of the atmospheric processors 3 kilometers north, the distant clank of a cargo drone doing its 0400 run, the silence underneath all of it, which was the particular silence of a place that had been carved out of a moon that hadn't wanted to be carved. She was Citizen 481 Feen Sic 2 1 Sic T2 3 42. She got up, she made coffee, she checked the bulletin feed on the apartment wall screen while she waited for it to brew, and that was when she saw the notice. Infraction notice, Citizen 481 Feen 162342. Unauthorized traversal of restricted corridor, level 9 Delta. Date of infraction, 14/7/2187. Fine, 840 credits. Report to Colonial Compliance Office, Sublevel 4, Block 7, within 72 hours or subject to automated asset freeze. Dara stared at it long enough that the coffee finished brewing and she didn't notice. She hadn't been anywhere near level 9 Delta on the 14th. She'd been on shift at the water reclamation plant. 12 hours, start to finish, with 36 coworkers who could confirm every minute of it. She didn't own a transit pass for the inner corridors. She'd never applied for one. She didn't even know where level 9 Delta was. She poured her coffee and sat down and looked at the notice again. The amount, 840 credits, was not catastrophic. She could pay it. She'd done nothing wrong, but the bureaucratic grind of disputing an automated fine was the kind of thing people quietly described as worse than just paying. She'd heard the stories, everyone had, and yet something stubborn in the marrow of her sat still and refused. She was not going to pay 840 credits for something she did not do. She finished her coffee. She put on her jacket. She went to find the Colonial Compliance Office. The Colonial Compliance Office occupied sub-level 4 of Block 7, which meant descending through 4 elevator banks, navigating a maintenance corridor that smelled of recycled coolant, following signage that became incrementally more confusing the deeper she went, and eventually emerging into a lobby that was, against all reasonable expectation, cheerful. The walls were a warm amber. There were synthetic plants in pots along the edges. The ceiling was high and lit with panels that mimicked natural daylight, though the daylight they mimicked was from a planet Dara had never been to. A G-type star's generous yellow. 3 receptionists sat behind a curved desk of polished composite, and behind them a wall of doors stretched in both directions. The receptionists were Varathi. This was not unusual. The Varath Compact had administered colonial compliance operations across 17 human settlements for the past 30 years. Under the terms of the Second Integration Treaty, which most humans had never read and which most Varathi understood perfectly, down to the exact clauses that conferred procedural authority in cases of citizen administrative ambiguity. The Compact were not cruel employers. They were efficient. They were precise. They treated the humans in their care the way a clockmaker treats the gears inside a watch, with great attention and no particular sense of the gear's interiority. The nearest receptionist inclined her head. She was roughly humanoid. Most of the Varathi who worked customer-facing roles underwent the courtesy of mild phenotypic adjustment. But her eyes were amber gold, split-pupilled, and tracked Dara's approach with the unhurried confidence of something that has never needed to rush, because the world has always eventually come to it. Citizen number, she said. Her voice was warm, precisely calibrated to a frequency that humans found reassuring. Studies had been done. The Compact had read them. 481 Phi 162342, Dara said. I'm here about an infraction notice. There's been an error. The receptionist's fingers moved across a surface Dara couldn't see. A faint chime. Citizen Warzeniak, Dara. Infraction reference 9D14-2187-004432. A pause. The infraction has been confirmed by 2 independent sensor arrays. I wasn't there. Another pause. The receptionist's expression did not change exactly, but something behind her eyes shifted in the way that a closed door shifts when someone on the other side of it leans against it. The sensor arrays confirm the traversal of level 9 Delta by an individual matching your biometric profile. Either the sensor arrays are wrong, or something matched my biometrics that isn't me. The probability of sensor error in a dual array confirmation is 0.003%. That's not zero, Dara said. A longer pause. The other 2 receptionists had stopped their work, almost imperceptibly, in the way that colleagues pretend not to listen to a conversation while listening to every word. You may submit a formal dispute, the receptionist said finally. You will need to proceed to Counter 7, Sublevel 4B, with your citizen documentation, proof of alternate location, and a completed Form 17C. Do you have a Form 17C? No. Forms are available at Counter 3. Counter 3 was down a corridor to the left, through a door that opened onto a space that looked exactly like the lobby except smaller, where a single Varathi clerk sat behind a desk and handed her a Form 17C without making eye contact. The form was 14 pages. Dara stood in the corridor and looked at it. She filled in her name. She filled in her citizen number. She filled in the infraction reference. She got to Section 4, which asked her to list all biometric records associated with her citizen profile, and stopped because she didn't know that information, and the form provided no guidance on where to find it. She went back to the receptionist. I need to know what biometric records are associated with my profile. That information is held by the Citizen Registry. Where is the Citizen Registry? Level 12, Block 2. Citizen Registry is open Tuesdays and Thursdays, 0900 to 1400. It was Wednesday. Dara stood in the amber lobby for a moment, with its synthetic plants and its G-type sunlight, and its 3 pairs of amber gold eyes that were watching her with the patient, endless, slightly sorrowful attention of creatures who had seen this particular situation unfold more times than any of them had any reason to count. All right, she said. Thank you. She went home. She came back on Thursday. The Citizen Registry was a different kind of space, where compliance had been warm and amber and carefully designed to feel welcoming until it wasn't. The registry was simply gray, everything gray. The walls were a medium institutional gray. The floor was a slightly darker gray. The ceiling was a slightly lighter gray. The clerks were Varathi again, but these ones hadn't undergone any phenotypic adjustment, and they were taller, and their eyes were a different shade, and they moved with the specific deliberateness of bureaucrats who have learned, somewhere deep in their professional formation, that speed implies fallibility. She waited 45 minutes. She was called to a window. She asked for a printout of all biometric records associated with Citizen 4.8.162.342. The clerk looked at her screen. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at it the way you look at something that isn't there. I'm not finding that citizen number in our records, the clerk said. Dara felt something shift in her chest. I beg your pardon? Citizen 481-162-342. It's not returning a record. I've had that number for 34 years. I understand. The number is registered in the compliance system, but there's no corresponding primary record in registry. How is that possible? There may have been a migration error when the databases were consolidated in 2181. The new system uses a different architecture. Some records. The clerk stopped. A different kind of pause than the receptionists, this one more personal, though still carefully professional. Some records fell between the systems. So what does that mean for me? It means, the clerk said, that in order to complete your Form 17C, you'll need to first establish a new registry record, which requires a completed Form 3A, verified by 2 witnesses who are already in the registry system, plus your original birth documentation, plus a biometric scan, which will then be submitted to the verification division for processing. How long does processing take? Between 6 and 18 months. Dara stared at her. The fine has a 72-hour payment window. For payment, yes. For dispute, you have 30 days. But the dispute requires a registry record that will take 6 to 18 months. The clerk held her gaze. There was something in her eyes. Not cruelty, nothing like that. Something almost like recognition. The dispute process, she said, carefully, is designed for citizens with complete records. Then what do I do? The clerk was quiet for a moment longer than any of the silences before it. Then she said very quietly, you could speak with a Level 4 administrator. If the gap in your record predates the infraction, they have discretionary authority to place a procedural hold while your record is re-established. Where do I find a Level 4 administrator? Counter 7. Sublevel 4B. That's where I was told to submit my Form 17C, yes. Counter 7 handles both. She did not cry in the elevator going back down to Sublevel 4B. She came close, not from grief, but from the sheer mechanical friction of it. The sense of being a physical object that had been introduced into a system not built to accommodate it, of being ground between gears that weren't broken but weren't made for her. She pressed the back of her wrist to her forehead and breathed and thought about the water reclamation plant, about the clean, reliable logic of intake valves and filtration sequences. about problems that had causes and causes that had solutions. She thought, the sensor arrays are either wrong or they scanned someone else. She thought, neither of those things becomes less true because the paperwork is impossible. She thought, I am here. I am real. I was somewhere else on the 14th. The elevator doors opened. Counter 7 was staffed by a single Varathi administrator of considerable age. She could tell by the ridge texture along the jaw, a thing that happens slowly in their species, like tree rings. His nameplate said Senior Administrator Thivak. He was reading something on a tablet when she arrived, and he finished the sentence he was reading before he looked up, which told her something about him, though she wasn't sure exactly what. Citizen number, he said. 481 Fiend 162342. I have an infraction notice and a missing registry record and a Form 17C that I can't complete in 72. She stopped, recalibrated. 30 days before the freeze. He took the tablet she offered, the Form 17C, with its 14 pages and its unanswerable Section 4, and he looked at it the way the registry clerk had looked at her screen for a long time. Tell me, he said, and his voice was different from the receptionist's, lower, with a harmonic undertone that she suspected was natural rather than calibrated. Tell me what you believe happened. No one had asked her that yet, she told him. She told him about the notice and the water reclamation shift and the 12 hours and the 36 co-workers. She told him about the sensor probability and why 0.003% wasn't zero. She told him about the registry gap and the migration error and the 2181 consolidation. She spoke for about 4 minutes. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. You are aware, he said, that you are not the first person to be caught in this particular gap. She had not been aware. How many others? In this settlement, since the consolidation, 41 citizens. Of those, 38 resolved through the standard process. And the other 3? 2 appealed to the regional ombudsman. 1 is ongoing. He paused. The 38th resolution took 4 years. 4 years, she sat with that number. Outside, somewhere far above them, through levels and levels of steel and composite and recycled air. The atmospheric processors were still running, and the water plant was still running. And people were living their lives in the settlement she'd called home for 12 years. People who presumably existed in the citizen registry without having fallen through the architecture of a database migration in 2181. She thought about what 4 years of procedural limbo would mean. The fine compounding, the asset freeze, the job, the apartment. I can place a procedural hold, the Vox said, as I am authorized to do in cases of apparent systemic error. He tapped something on his desk. It will protect you from the asset freeze while your record is being reestablished. It will not, however, resolve the infraction. But if my record shows I didn't exist in the system at the time of the infraction, then the infraction was technically filed against a non-existent citizen, he said. And something in the way he said it was so dry and so precise that it took her a moment to understand he was telling her something useful, which would make the infraction procedurally invalid. She looked at him. He looked back at her with his amber gold eyes and his tree-ring jaw, and the particular expression of a creature who has spent decades inside a system and has learned exactly how far the words of the system can bend before they break, and has no power to break them himself, but can point at the place where they bend. The Form 3A, she said, to re-establish my record. You said I need 2 witnesses already in the registry. Correct. What counts as a witness? Any citizen in good standing with a complete registry record who can attest to having known you for at least 2 years. She had 36 co-workers who could confirm where she'd been on the 14th. She went home. She called them. Mira Osi answered on the second ring, laughed when Dara explained, and said she'd been wondering when someone would finally fight one of these. June Castillo said he'd been to the registry himself once and he'd got in and out in a single visit and he hadn't known that was unusual until now, that it was wrong, that he would absolutely testify. Old Prakash, who'd worked water reclamation for 20 years and had the calluses and the stubborn look of someone who'd spent 2 decades fixing problems. The systems people said were unfixable, said, and she would remember this later, the exact inflection of it. You know what they never figure out about us? We don't get tired of our own problems the way they think we do. They think if they make it hard enough, we go away. We don't go away. She went back to Block 2 on the following Tuesday with Mira and June. She filed the Form 3A. Prakash came as the second witness for June's required signature. 3 of her other co-workers turned up in the lobby on request because the story had moved through the plant on morning shift. and they'd come on their lunch break. The registry clerk, a different one this time, younger, looked at the lobby full of water reclamation workers. With an expression Dara couldn't fully read, and processed the form in 20 minutes rather than the standard hour. The record was flagged for expedited processing, 6 weeks rather than 6 to 18 months. 6 weeks was a long time, it was not 4 years. She walked back through the gray corridors of the registry, with Mira and June on either side of her, and Prakash a half step behind. And she thought about how she'd woken up that morning 12 days ago and looked at a notice on the wall screen and made a decision that had seemed small at the time. She thought about the lobbies and the synthetic plants and the amber light designed to be reassuring. She thought about the clerk who had told her, very quietly, about level 4 administrators and their discretionary authority. She thought about Thivak with his tree-ring jaw and his careful language. She thought, none of those people wanted to do it to her. The Varathi weren't cruel. The system was, what? Not cruel either. Something worse than cruel, in a way. Indifferent. Built for the median case, the average citizen, the person who existed cleanly in both databases simultaneously, and simply not built for the exception, for the gap, for the fallen-through record, she thought. But it bends. The hearing was not a hearing, technically. It was a procedural review, which took place in a small room off sublevel 4B that smelled of filtered air and had a table and 4 chairs and a wall screen, and was otherwise indistinguishable from every other small room she'd been in over the past 6 weeks. Senior Administrator Thivak was present. A representative from the Compliance Division was present. A younger Varathi named Assessor Veth, whose phenotypic adjustment was more pronounced than any she'd seen, almost human, except for the stillness. There was also, which surprised her, a regional observer. A Varathi she didn't know, whose nameplate said simply Observer Marek. The Varathi had no legal requirement to send an observer to a procedural review of this kind. She didn't know why one was there. She made her case. She had her shift records. She had the testimony statements from 11 co-workers, signed and registry verified. She had the re-established citizen file. She had the procedural hold. She had the gap. Assessor Veth reviewed everything with the focused, slightly forward-tilted attention of someone reading a document they expect to disagree with and are looking for the place to do it. He found 2 places. The shift records, he pointed out, showed she had been on shift, but did not confirm her physical location within the plant at every moment. And biometric sensor data at 0.003% error rate across 2 independent arrays remained a compelling counterpoint. 0.03% error rate, Dara said, means that across the 17 human settlements the compact administers, with approximately 12 million registered citizens who move through monitored corridors daily, you would expect roughly 360 false positives per day. Veth was quiet. I'm not saying the system is broken, she continued. I'm saying the system at its stated performance level generates errors. And I'm one of them. She'd done the math on the walkover. She wasn't a mathematician. She was a water reclamation technician who understood the gap between a theoretical error rate and the actual physical reality of what that error rate meant at scale. Because that was exactly the kind of thing you thought about when you were responsible for filtration systems that kept people alive. Thivak said nothing. He had said nothing since the opening, and she had the impression that he had calculated, with great precision, how many words he needed to say in this room, and had said them already, weeks ago, when he'd written the procedural hold. Observer Marek said into the silence, "The gap in the citizen record predates the infraction date by a minimum of 6 years. A finding of infraction against a citizen who did not exist in the record at the time of infraction would be..." A pause, the briefest one she'd heard from any Varathi, which somehow conveyed the most. Philosophically complicated. Assessor Veth looked at his tablet. He looked at it for a long time. "The infraction," he said finally, "is dismissed. On procedural grounds. The fine," Dara said. Voided, she didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She sat with it for a moment, this small, specific, hard-won nothing, the absence of a fine she'd never owed, and felt it settle into her the way a correctly closed valve settles. A clean mechanical resolution, everything where it should be. She thanked Thivak on the way out. He inclined his head in a way she thought might mean something. In Varathi, though she didn't know the specifics. She nodded back and went home. But that was not the end of it. She hadn't expected it to be. She'd been in the system now. She knew the topology of it, the places it bent, the clerks who would lean a door open an inch if you stood in the right place, and waited long enough. She'd told a few people the story. The story had told itself further. 3 months after the hearing, she was contacted by a woman named Sophia Renz, citizen 7221 Mead 8910003, who had a parking infraction for a corridor on level 7 she'd never visited, and whose citizen record showed a gap of indeterminate origin. Sophia had found Dara through June, who'd mentioned it to someone at another plant, who'd mentioned it to someone else. She had 8 co-workers who could testify. She didn't have Dara's experience with the forms. Dara helped. The Renz case took 3 weeks. The infraction was dismissed on procedural grounds. After Sophia came a man named Henrik Lau, citizen 2L445679001. After Henrik came a woman named Berenica Choi, who was 11 years old, and whose infraction notice had come to her father, who had called 3 offices in one day and been told 3 different things, and was, by the time he found Dara, operating at a controlled simmer of parental fury that she found both admirable and useful. The Choi case was different. Berenica's record wasn't missing, it was flagged, for reasons no one would explain directly, with a notation that Dara eventually identified, through a clerk who went slightly out of protocol to help, as a cross-system categorization error left over from the 2179 settlement expansion, when the block assignments had been renumbered, and about 200 records had been reassigned to incorrect subsystems, which meant they existed, but were invisible to the compliance sensors, which meant the sensors registered no authorized biometric match, and defaulted to unauthorized traversal, which meant everyone in those 200 records had been getting infraction notices for 8 years. 8 years. She found the notation in a footnote of a system update document from 2183 that no one had actioned. She submitted a formal finding to the Compliance Division, the Citizen Registry, and the Regional Ombudsman, with a detailed breakdown of the categorization error, a list of all 200 affected citizen numbers, and a request for retroactive voiding of all infractions notices issued against those citizens over the past 8 years, with reimbursement of any fines paid. She filed it on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in the corridor outside the registry in her work jacket, on a tablet she'd borrowed from Mira. She sent copies to the 11 co-workers who'd signed her original testimony statements. She sent a copy to Thavak, with a brief note that said she thought he might find it relevant. She sent a copy to Observer Merrick. She went back to work. The response from the Compliance Division came 6 weeks later. It was 8 pages, thoroughly formatted, deeply bureaucratic, and its conclusion, buried in the language of the final section, under a heading called Operational Recommendation 4C, Systemic Reconciliation Protocol, was yes. All 200 citizen numbers would be reviewed. Infraction notices found to derive from the 2179 categorization error would be voided. Fines paid would be reimbursed. A working group would be formed to conduct a comprehensive audit of all cross-system categorization records, dating from the 2179 expansion. The working group would include, at the regional observer's specific request, a minimum of 2 citizen representatives with direct experience of administrative error. Sophia Renz took one of the seats. Dara took the other. The first working group meeting was in a conference room on level 8, block 1, which was a floor she'd never been to, in a building she'd never entered. It was nothing like sublevel 4B. The ceiling was taller. The light panels were set to something closer to the actual output of the system's star, which was different, cooler, a slightly blue-white, a light she'd grown up under, and that the calibrated amber of the lower offices had been quietly overriding for years. She sat down at the table and looked at that light, and felt something in her chest she didn't have immediate language for. Observer Merrick was present. He sat across from her, and he looked at her with his amber gold eyes for a moment before the meeting started, and she thought, she wasn't sure, that he was doing what Thavak had done in that small corridor off sublevel 4B, calculating the words, counting them. I reviewed your submission, he said, the analysis of the 2179 error. Yes, it was thorough, it was obvious, she said, once you knew where to look. A pause. Many things are, he said. The meeting started. There were 6 Varathi administrators in the room, and 2 humans, and a stack of documents, and a wall screen displaying a database architecture diagram that looked, when she first saw it, like a map of a place that had been built by several different people who had never spoken to each other. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "Can I ask a question about the 2183 update document?" The room looked at her. She'd been in enough rooms now, enough offices and corridors and waiting areas, to know how to hold herself in one without disappearing. She asked her question. It was a good question. It went to the root. The audit took 14 months. It found, in the end, not 200 affected citizen records, but 847. It found 3 separate data migration errors, not one. It found a cross-referencing failure in the 2181 database consolidation. The same one that had swallowed her own record, that had generated erroneous infraction notices for citizens who had record gaps not because of the 2179 expansion, but because they'd been born on the settlement after to 2181, and their birth record had been filed in a subsystem that hadn't been correctly linked to the compliance sensor network. Some of those citizens had been paying incorrect fines for years, without knowing they could dispute them. Some of them had been young when the errors started, and were not young anymore. She sat with that one evening after a long session, in the corridor outside the working group room, with a cup of cooling coffee from the Level 8 commissary. Sophia was next to her, leaning against the wall, looking at the blue-white ceiling. "You know what I keep thinking about," Sophia said. "What?" "That first receptionist, at compliance, when she said 0.003% error rate like it was basically zero. I know, she wasn't lying, she was probably right. For most cases it is basically zero." Sophia looked at her coffee. She just never thought about what happens to the 0.003%. Dara thought about the lobby with its amber warmth and its synthetic plants. She thought about the way systems were designed for the majority, for the smooth average case, for the citizen who existed cleanly in all the right databases, and never fell through anything. She thought about Prakash, who had stood in the registry lobby on his lunch break, because the story had moved through the plant, and because that was the kind of person he was. The kind of people they were, people who didn't get tired of their own problems the way the system assumed they would. She thought about how Thivak had pointed, without technically pointing, at the exact place where the words bent. She thought about all the things that humans were not supposed to be good at: patience, paperwork, the incremental grinding work of institutions, and how the assumption behind that assessment was that the system's friction was neutral, that it was simply the cost of processing, that it asked equally of everyone who passed through it. The assumption was wrong. The friction was not neutral. It was calibrated, unconsciously, to a specific type of user, a type that had its records in order and its profile in both databases and no gaps, a type that had the luxury of the standard process. For everyone else, the friction was a wall, and walls, she had learned, were just doors that hadn't been found yet. The final report was submitted to the Colonial Administration of the Compact on a Thursday in late autumn, which on the settlement meant the atmospheric processors ran slightly warmer, and the dome lighting shifted through its annual simulation of seasonal change, a decision someone had made 40 years ago to keep the human population's circadian rhythms stable, and that had the unintended side effect of making the colony feel like a place with seasons, even though it didn't have any. She filed the report herself. She sat in the conference room on Level 8 and hit Submit on the document system, and then sat there for a moment while the light panels ran their slow simulation of an autumn afternoon on a planet she'd never visited. The report recommended systematic reconciliation of all cross-referenced administrative databases, a standing citizen review board with legal authority to flag procedural errors, mandatory error rate impact assessments for all automated infraction systems, calculated not as aggregate percentages but as absolute citizen counts, a formal revision of the dispute process to make it accessible to citizens without complete registry records. The Compact approved 4 of the 6 recommendations within 60 days. The 5th was referred to a policy subcommittee. The 6th was approved 8 months later. None of it was fast. None of it was easy. None of it was the kind of thing that made headlines or earned speeches. It was the slow, stubborn, unglamorous work of finding the places where the machine ground against the people it was supposed to serve, and describing them precisely enough that the machine had to stop and adjust. She went home that evening and made coffee. She stood at the window and looked at the dome, at the amber light the processors diffused through it, and drank her coffee while the simulated autumn moved slow and amber outside. Nothing like any autumn she'd ever seen, all of it built to keep her well. Citizen 481162342 existed in the registry now. She had verified it herself twice. The record was clean and complete and linked correctly across all 3 major databases and showed no gaps anywhere. She was real. She had always been real. The system had been wrong about that. And she had spent 14 months making sure the system understood exactly what it had been wrong about, and why, and what needed to change so that it didn't happen to the next person, or the next 847. That was all. That was everything. A month after the report, she got a message from a man on the settlement's outer ring, a maintenance worker named Pavel, citizen 9003441-2020, who had received an infraction notice for a corridor he'd never visited, and who had found her name through the Citizen Review Board's public contact list, which hadn't existed 6 months ago. She wrote back within the hour. She told him to come in on Thursday. She told him to bring any coworkers who could testify, and his work schedule, and whatever documentation he had. She told him it was going to take time, but that it was going to be okay. She told him because it was true, and because she thought he needed to hear it. They have never figured out that we don't get tired of our own problems the way they think we do. She sent the message. She put on her jacket. She went to work. Outside in the dome, the atmospheric processors hummed their steady hum, keeping the air clean and the pressure stable and the temperature within a 2-degree tolerance, doing their work with the same patient, grinding, incremental diligence as everything else. As the water reclamation plant, as the Citizen Review Board, as the woman walking through the corridor with her coffee and her jacket and her complete and verified and indelible record, who had started all of this because she did not own a car and she was not going to pay for one.